You all for joining us today. I am Walt Bauer, and I'm the Pre-Service Training Coordinator at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. Welcome to the Human Development Institute's first fall seminar in the HDI seminar series. My brief visual description is I am a white male wearing glasses with hazel eyes and a blue collared shirt with a blue, white, and gray tie. My pronouns are he, him, his. My virtual background is a three-story brick academic building that has offices for the Human Development Institute on the University of Kentucky campus. We use Zoom for our virtual platform. Our speakers will provide an opportunity for questions today. We welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box for a robust question and answer session. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A option. Please use the chat box for technical questions. We have real-time captioning for the webinar and the closed captioning feature. Turn on the captioning by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen and then clicking Show Subtitle. Should you have any questions about CEUs, you can contact me. My email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. Again, my email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. Please take a moment to complete our brief evaluation. You will receive an email that provides a link to access the session evaluation after the seminar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming webinars. The title of the webinar is The Pitfalls and Benefits of AI in Employment of People with Disabilities. Our panelists are Dr. Trey Knatzer, the director of the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at the University of Kentucky. We also have Dr. DJ Hendricks, the director for the Center for Disability Inclusion at West Virginia University. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Knatzer.
Okay, thank you, Walt. My name is DJ Hendricks, and as Walt said, I am the director of the Center for Disability Inclusion at West Virginia University. Likely you haven't heard of that, but what you may have heard more about is our primary project called the Job Accommodation Network, and I'll be talking more about Jan in a little bit. I've been here at the center for 45 plus years. Looking forward to another 2 or 3 at least. I was here before Jan started, and so was on the ground floor of that project. And at this point now, we're handling about 55,000 cases a year. And we have just an absolutely fabulous website that I'll provide you with the information to access later on. I look forward to going through the presentation today and thank everybody for being here. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Knatzer.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. I'm Trey Knatzer. As Walt said, I direct the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at the University of Kentucky, the Assistant Provost for Teaching and Learning at the university. We take care of a lot of professional development, leadership, support, and resources around education and any kinds of challenges and opportunities related to that at the University of Kentucky. And probably our top issue of the last almost 2 years now is generative AI. And that has been the second life of our center, has been one of the continuing responders and hubs of activity around learning more about AI in all of its fast-paced developments and all of the issues that we're learning about, as well as helping people become more skilled, effective, and ethical users of AI. I should also say that I am the co-chair of a group called UK Advance, at the university, which is our university level task force that was charged by the president last year to develop and maintain guidelines around the use of AI in education, research, clinical care, and administration, as well as to address any questions or issues from the university community around the use of AI. And the last thing I'll say, because it's relevant to how I approach talking about artificial intelligence and generative AI in particular, is that my academic background is in writing studies and English. I'm an affiliate of our Department of Writing here at the University of Kentucky. I frequently teach courses in technical and professional writing, as well as other writing intensive courses across the curriculum. And I have been using AI in my courses as well. So it is a particular interest of mine and has been since it first came out as a tool that in one version of generative AI automates the process of writing. So I'm coming at it from all those directions, from a critical, ethical, technical, and educational viewpoint. DJ, anything else before we get into the part about what AI is, why now, and what the issues are?
I don't have anything, Trey. Please feel free to go right ahead.
All right.
We can see it, Trey.
Great. All right. So I thought that first it would be useful to level set a little bit about generative AI itself and AI broadly, um, because we might have heard a lot about these terms, whether in work, education, life. You've read some headlines, perhaps, and it can be a little mind-boggling about what exactly we're all talking about when it comes to AI and what it's doing, what it is, and what it means for all of us. And I'll just name that the challenge of this is truly in kind of keeping up with the pace of development. It's a very disorienting and disruptive invention. And we have had artificial intelligence for quite a while, and I'll get into that in a bit. But November 30th, 2022 was the first day that we had ChatGPT, the first publicly available generative AI. And from there, it can feel really overwhelming in terms of keeping up with the pace of development, in feeling overwhelmed because it seems like we all have to suddenly know a lot of advanced technical things about how AI works. And I try to take a really humane approach around how, we need to be aware of what's happening, but it also is putting too much on anyone to have to become, a computer scientist in order to understand. So I'm going to try to thread that needle here in this presentation. So the idea is to demystify it a little bit. And in doing so, that helps us approach the concept of AI a bit more critically and with kind of a clear head when it comes to thinking about bias, when it comes to thinking about harm or mitigating harm, in the topic for today around employment, people with disabilities, and so on. So I'm going to actually just advance onwards from this slide. So what is generative AI? What it is and how it works with and against us. I'm showing a picture of Clippy right now on the screen. Clippy is the kind of infamous little cartoon paperclip from earlier generations of Microsoft Office software that would pop up and tell us that it would notice something about what we're doing, whether it appears that we're writing a resume or that we're writing a letter. It would ask us if we needed help with these things, and it might, help us by formatting some things on the page and so on. Clippy has emerged as a kind of joke precedent for generative AI as a kind of predecessor, that is, for the current technologies that we have, because Clippy is sort of observing what we're doing, and then it's interpreting what we're doing, and then um, producing some output as a result of all of that. And so it can be maybe a little bit of a useful precedent to think about how we've progressed from there to here. But what is generative AI versus regular AI or machine learning? There's a lot of metaphors that you might have heard if you're following any of the headlines that are coming up on your social media or just your web browsing. There's a lot of different kinds of language that might be used to describe what generative AI is. Some people might refer to it as a personal assistant. Some people might call it a calculator. Some people might call it let's say, a creative partner or co-intelligence. All of these things have different meanings, and they kind of influence how we understand what AI is and how it works. So it's different to say that it's like a calculator versus a personal assistant, because we might use a calculator to offload the task of doing math so that we can focus on making more decisions about the process or the project that we're working on, versus a personal assistant is maybe someone that we would sort of assign autonomous tasks to, and they would then go on and perform those tasks and come back to us with the end results, such as bringing together some contact information from our Rolodex and bringing it back to us. Or if it's a creative partner, we're going to value the input that it's giving us. We're going to value the ideas that it brings to the table, and we're kind of putting into it the understanding that it has a perspective, it has something of a viewpoint of the world to contribute. So all of these things are really important to consider. That first of all, the way that we talk about it is going to imply something about how we understand it, but secondly, that everything is a metaphor with AI, and that makes it both exciting and interesting, but also, again, very complicated to talk about, because artificial intelligence itself is a kind of metaphor. To call a computer that's running a mathematical process intelligent is sort of different than when we're describing a human being as intelligent. And so there's all of these slippages, all of these moments where we're sliding from kind of one meaning to the next and using metaphor and simile and analogy to describe all of this. And so I just wanted to name that because when we talk about it in the case of employment and bias, avoiding harm, avoiding risk, these sorts of frameworks can influence, our understanding of how it can do things well, what it is maybe at more of a risk to do badly, and how it can impact the lived experiences of different kinds of people. So here's a timeline that I wanted to talk about, because we've been hearing about AI ever since ChatGPT came out in late 2022, but often this term AI gets thrown around quite a bit, and it can mean lots of different things. And I wanted to draw us all the way back to the 1950s, in fact, and say that the term emerged from Dartmouth, and that the idea at this summer institute of Dartmouth was that they wanted to try to take every aspect of learning or every other feature of intelligence to simulate that with a machine, to make a model of that and simulate it, that's what artificial intelligence was going to be. And for those of you that want to take a deep dive, there's actually a pretty robust debate, even all the way back then, as to what artificial intelligence means and what it's seeking. But I've asked students here at the university when I give talks to them about AI, I ask them, when do you think the first chatbot came out? And in asking them that, I'll give them different decades. I'll do a poll. And most students will choose a decade that is either the decade immediately prior to the one that we're in, or at the earliest 2000 to 2010, usually. But in fact, we have the first chatbot in the 1960s called Eliza, that was mimicking a psychotherapist. That was the most popular program of Eliza. It was pretty primitive by today's standards. It would largely take the statements of a user or patient and rephrase them in the form of probing questions or observations. So it was proceeding on a fairly narrow basis of performing a kind of rearrangement of the language that we were all using. But it was still the first chatbot that people interacted with. So we have actually quite a bit of time from the 60s all the way to today, when there is just a lot of breakthroughs in the past 15 years or so that have led to what we more popularly right now think of as AI. And a couple of them I've listed here. In 2014, the idea of generative adversarial networks. In 2017, the deep learning architecture. I'm not a computer scientist, so it's not as if I have an incredibly deep understanding of how these things work. But what's significant is that they allowed researchers and developers to take massive amounts of language, data about language, let's say all of the language that would be on the internet and in other sources, as much as you could get your hands on. If you could think about just grabbing every book in every library around the world, going to every web page that exists and downloading all the words on there. They were able to develop a way of telling a computer to analyze and represent all of that language mathematically. That's generally what these adversarial networks and transformer architecture technologies allowed researchers to do, is to mathematically represent massive amounts of language data in terms of the relationship of words to other words. And it's a very kind of heady, big topic, but that allowed us to develop what we now use, what many of us already use, as ChatGPT and other large language model driven generative AI tools. In 2022, when ChatGPT came out, it was the quickest that any app or software grew to 1 million users. It took 5 days. The previous record had been held by Instagram, and that was for 2.5 months. So 5 days versus 2.5 months. That's a big difference in terms of users. And I believe that I was reading that at any given moment right now around the world, there's something around 180 million active users of ChatGPT at any given moment. So there's a lot of people. Now, for the first 6 months or so, when we talked about AI, we really meant ChatGPT. But since then, there has been another just explosion of developments. New AI models are being developed. So ChatGPT, which is developed by OpenAI, it has one of those mathematical models of language that it's developed. But then Google made its own, and other organizations like Anthropic, like X Twitter, like a company called Mistral, like Facebook Meta, all these companies are developing their own models of language based on as much data as they can get, using these techniques to train computers to recognize the relationships from words to other words. And so at our current moment, we have lots of options, and it can be kind of dizzying in terms of all the different apps, platforms, things that we can get a freemium account or things we have to pay for. But we're at a moment where there are typically some major platforms out there. Google's Gemini is one of them. Anthropic's Claude is another. Of course, we do have ChatGPT still. And there's some others that are also closing the gap, but those are some of the three big ones. And it's important to think about how AI works, both generative AI as well as other kinds of artificial intelligence, because generative is important there. Generative means that these software platforms, et cetera, are generating things. So in addition to previous kinds of AI technologies that, say, would be used in medicine, where a computer would be fed millions of X-ray images in order to better understand and diagnose, let's say, anomalies in an X-ray of a certain type. What it's doing there is kind of identifying patterns and identifying deviations from those patterns to help doctors make better diagnoses, faster diagnoses. Generative AI is taking it a step further. It's not just looking at the patterns. It's not just saying that, well, typically in language, sentences work this way. When we have a Wikipedia article, typically here's the pattern of language in a Wikipedia article. It understands all those things, but it also then will create its own text and output that follows the same rules, that follows the same patterns and mathematical relationships that it's been trained on. So whenever you talk to ChatGPT, what it's doing is, in a really bizarre way, even though it sounds like you're talking to a person quite often, it sounds very realistic. And we all can remember that moment if we've used any of these tools, when we see the output for the first time and we're shocked as to how accurate it can seem, human-like. Some people will say that it writes better than they do, that it sounds better than that they sound as a writer. And it's a really kind of bizarre thing to think about how it's sort of guessing each word in a sequence based on the questions that you ask it and the things that you tell it to do. And it's using all of those patterns, those mathematical patterns that it's learned from billions and billions of data points that it's analyzed. And so as a way of visualizing that, earlier today, what I did with Claude, which is one of the big generative AI models out there, is that I spent this took me about half an hour. And what I did was I was using Claude and ChatGPT at the same time to see which one would do it first. And Claude ended up winning for some reason. ChatGPT's been really having a hard time today for some reason. And that's another thing to note, is that these tools are a bit mercurial right now. But with Claude, I was able to just do a basic interactive demo for what happens when you ask a question to a large language model and what's happening when it gives you language as output, when it seems to talk to you. So on my screen here, there's just one question. It's just a blank white screen, but there's just one question that I can select. For some reason, I could not make this work with multiple questions, but that doesn't matter. The question that I'm going to select, and this is just an example question, is what would happen if gravity suddenly disappeared? This is just an example of a question that you might ask a large language model. I think it's a really good example of a question because it's not merely factual. You're not just asking it to retrieve a piece of information for you in the same way that when you make a Google search, you say, like, who was the general in this battle, or who was chancellor of this uh, country when this event happened. Information retrieval. There's information out there that you can retrieve, and it's a kind of fact. But what this question is doing is it's really pushing the AI to speculate. It's pushing it to use what, as humans, we might call an imagination. And so I'm going to click on this question. What would happen if gravity suddenly disappeared? So we see the response. And now I'm going to talk you through the animation that you're seeing right now, because as the words are coloring blue, you're going to see that the bar charts below are actually adjusting because they're showing you what the AI is guessing as the next word based on probability. And it's a very complicated calculation when an AI is determining the statistical probability of what word should come next. But every time it puts a word on the screen, it's guessing what's the next word that I should put on the screen. And I'm actually just going to reload it and do it again so we can see it again. But here, again, once we progress through the sentence, we're seeing that with each word, it's then guessing what is the percent likelihood for what the next word should be based on all the patterns in all my training data. And here it's, we have the most common ones that are coming up. This is an incredibly reductive demonstration, but it's one that I think is fairly easy to understand. There's a lot more math that goes into it, of course, but this is kind of basically what's happening whenever we see language appear on the screen. And that's a really important thing to consider, because it can feel like AI is thinking whenever it's producing language, producing images, when it seems to talk to us. But when we talk to others, we're not basing our choice of words and language and ideas on statistical probability of words. It's just a very different way of understanding the world. So some things that we find to be really important when at my teaching center or for any other aspect of my role that we talk about responsible use of AI, it's that we have an understanding of AI in the technical sense, in terms of what I was just talking about, that we have an understanding of AI from the ethical sense, of the ethics of how these technologies were developed, the ethics of how the organizations are being run, the ethics of how the technologies work, how they can be used and impact other people. And then finally, the kind of practical skill sets that we all develop around the best strategies for using the tools effectively. Because if we use them like Google, it doesn't work so well. If we use them as if they're a human, it kind of works, but sometimes we run into issues. There are some techniques for interacting with AI that with practice, we get a little bit better. But particularly in terms of using AI appropriately and responsibly, there's kind of a 4-layer model that we like to talk about at UK's Teaching Center. And of course, the core is our legal compliance of things in my world in education. That's like the privacy of student records, the UK's medical system. That's, of course, our patient privacy and confidentiality. There's a lot of legal obligations that we have to make sure that we maintain. There's compliance with things like accreditors and other sorts of governing bodies that we need to make sure. UK is, of course, accredited as a university by a particular organization. There's internal policy at UK around privacy, around responsible and ethical work, employee and staff conduct, student rights and responsibilities, patient rights and responsibilities. There's a lot of policy that we have to make sure that our use of AI is aligning with all of these things. And then beyond all of that, there's just our general sense of ethics, or what is good, or what is good for people in general, and avoiding any kinds of harm that we might inflict directly or indirectly upon others because of our use of AI technologies. And that's some more that we'll get into today. So the future of work with these technologies is still, of course, wildly speculative. We don't really know what everything's going to look like. There's a lot of, I think, guessing in the conversation about AI. There's a lot of thought leaders. There's a lot of, say, self-branded thought leaders about AI who are very certain about what the impact on work is going to be. But one thing that we can be, I think, fairly sure of is that AI is currently augmenting and will continue to augment many tasks in people's jobs. It will be integrated into many people's workflows as a tool, whether that tool is ChatGPT or whether it's something just a little bit more built in to the digital environment that people use at their jobs. For example, here at UK Healthcare, we use Epic for our digital healthcare records. And their Epic is working on rolling out AI features. So we're going to start seeing the software that we already use incorporate AI. So if you are an Adobe person, you use the Adobe suite, they've put some AI in already. Microsoft Office has started to do it. We'll see it kind of everywhere. So that means that time and effort for jobs and the search for jobs will shift. The way that jobs are posted, how we sort of think about hiring is going to maybe shift depending on roles and responsibilities. We have this focus on efficiency and productivity. This is often the value proposition of AI. So it's going to save us time and it's going to automate things that we spend too much time doing so that we can focus on more important tasks. But this can be an overstated argument, and sometimes it can sort of skip over some really important conversations about human oversight, human agency, ethics and appropriate use, making sure that we're not erecting barriers for some people to fully participate in our organizations, and making sure that how we use AI is aligning with our mission and vision, our values as an organization, just in the name of efficiency. So that means that human accountability is going to actually increase with the use of AI systems, so that we're trying to make sure that there's no both direct or indirect harms that we're causing by our use of AI systems, which means that we all need to be a bit more conversant about what AI is, how it works. And then we'll sort of need internal clarity in our organizations around policy, around how we think about AI as an organization, how we approach it for our work. And we'll all learn together for all of that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to DJ to talk a little bit more about how these big picture things are going to kind of specifically resonate in the area of jobs, work, hiring, and employment, and people with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Knatzer. That was really informative. I enjoyed that. I hope the audience members did too. I am going to share my screen in the hope that I could get, let's see, let me go full.
We can see it.
We can see it. Yay. Okay, that's always a win. All right. I'm going to go ahead and advance beyond this one. It's taking a little time here. It's not wanting to let me. There we go. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the Job Accommodation Network so that you have an idea more where I'm coming from in the area of AI, and also the team that's behind me that is actually the public facing, working with people who need information. where they're kind of coming from. Jan was established first in 1983, so we've been here for a little over 40 years now. It's a national, available anywhere throughout the country, free, I always like to emphasize that, consulting service. We provide customized, expert, trusted, and confidential guidance on job accommodations and disability employment issues. That to me is an extremely important element. This is not a one-size-fits-all type of answer system. It's customized to the specific needs of the employer, what the position is, the individual's disability, their functional limitations, which I usually describe as any word ending in ing that you can think of, and environmental issues as well. JAN is a service of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. And so we are federally funded, and that's how we're able to do what we do for free. Anybody can use JAN. It doesn't matter who it is. They need information about how to make workplace accommodations. We're here for them. But our primary audience is employers. And I think most of you in the audience today are probably employers. We also work a good deal with professionals who are working with people with disabilities, and that can be rehabilitation counselors, it can be doctors, it can be nurses, physical therapists, anybody who might be involved in assisting a person with a disability through kind of the problems that they might deal with in becoming employed or staying employed. We don't give legal information. We're not set up to do that. That's what lawyers are for, and they do it much better than we would. So it's important that we make that clear. We do have a lot of information in our website, and if you talk to one of our professionals, a lot of information about the Americans with Disabilities Act and other pertinent legislation, but we can't tell you specifically in any given instance what you should do legally or what you can expect out of the courts, anything like that. Here's what happens when you contact JAN. We have a variety of ways that you can reach us. We have a toll-free hotline. I'll give you the number here in just a little bit. We have a live chat on our website. The address for our website is askjan.org. You can email us. You can do a secure video teleconference, which is a fairly new option for us and is one that a lot of employers like to use. When you contact us, your first person that you're going to go through is not an artificial intelligence. It's a real person. It's a program assistant, and they're going to talk to you a little bit about what health condition is involved, a disability that the person has, what limitations they may have resulting from that, kind of what the level of those limitations may be. We're going to find out if you have any questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Are you just looking for how to go about making accommodations for that person? Exactly what do you need? Some questions, those program assistants can answer themselves. For others, and especially for working out detailed accommodation ideas or plans, they're going to send you on to one of our consultants. And I've always hated that term consultant because to me, that's always indicative of someone who's outside your organization that you're bringing in for help. And that's not the case with us. Our consultants are all employees of JAN. To me, that is a very important piece of information because our service is completely confidential. We never tell anybody who has called, why they've called. We will give aggregate information, so how many people have called each month and how many times people asked about particular elements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we never say Well, John Smith called us on the 15th of the month, and here was a question that John was asking about. We'll never do that. All of the information that we collect in order to be able to follow up as necessary, or if you call back in and need additional information, that is kept in a highly secure facility. Nobody is going to get access to it. Nobody's going to hack into that. So they'll go through with you the accommodation process. One of the things that we always emphasize, and you'll find a lot of information on our website about, is the interactive accommodation process. One of the things that we believe very firmly is that putting together a workable accommodation involves both the employer and the individual. You've got to have good communication back and forth to make sure that the needs of both parties are addressed, that both parties think that the accommodations that are discussed have a good likelihood of working. One of the things I've always said is if either party, either the employer or the individual, goes into an accommodation process thinking right up front, well, this is never going to work, big surprise, it won't work. So we like to see everybody be on board and say, yes, I think that this accommodation has a good likelihood, of addressing the needs that I have as an employer or as an individual, so that we can make that happen. We'll provide specific information on the accommodation solutions, and we'll give just really solid practical guidance about the Americans with Disabilities Act. One of the things I always like to tell any audience is that accommodations are really not as expensive as what you might think. I know one of the reasons that a lot of employers are somewhat hesitant to approach the idea of making accommodations is they think it's going to be extremely expensive. And especially when someone contacts Jan, a lot of times we can find really workable solutions that are not expensive. As a matter of fact, we do a follow-up survey of employers that have contacted us. We wait about 6 weeks, give enough time. We hope that they've been able to implement the accommodations that we've talked about. And then we ask them, did you make an accommodation? If you did, how much did it cost you to do? What we find is that more than half, and I mean 56% of the employers that we've surveyed, tell us that they were able to make the accommodation for no cost at all. And you say, well, how's that possible? Well, a lot of times accommodations involve more about how the work is done than about making any kind of physical changes. It may require that policies be changed, or maybe that some work activities get shared a little differently between some positions. Whatever it is, there are a lot of different ways that an individual with a disability can be accommodated with no cost. For those employers who did experience a cost, about 37% said that the accommodation resulted in a one-time cost. And that means typically they had to purchase something, some kind of device, or maybe a piece of software, something like that. For those employers, the median one-time expenditure was about $300. I mean, that just about any size company can afford an outlay of $300 in order to, say, keep a valued employee who has either developed a disability or has had a worsening of a disability occur. That's not so much money that you could say, well, that's just above and beyond what we could possibly afford to do, $300. The remaining 7% of employers encountered ongoing expenditures related to the accommodation. So that's very few of them. But this could be something like having to pay for an ongoing service, have perhaps a personal assistant available. For those employers, the median annual cost was a little under $2,000, $1,950. And we've got a full report on this if you'd like to read through it on our website. It's called Workplace Accommodations, Low Cost, High Impact. The other part to this that I would really like to point out is that we also asked these employers, did they get any benefits from making the accommodation? And the results are huge. Most of them, I mean, a very high percentage tell us that yes, they retained a valued employee. It costs an employer money every time they have to replace and put a new person into a job, because it's going to take a while for the new person to be able to do the job at the same level of productivity as the original or the first employee that had to leave. They'll tell us that they improve productivity for the individual. They eliminated costs of having to train a new employee. They improved attendance because if you put good accommodations into place, likely that's going to remove or at least reduce stress and other issues related to someone having to take time off work. And it's also improved the diversity of the company is another positive that employers report to us. And again, we're not just pulling this, out of air. This is what employers have told us they have experienced from making accommodations. So I have a screenshot up now of the main Jan website page. And the only reason that I'm showing you this is so that you get kind of an idea of all of the different options that are available to you from our website. It is massive. It gets about 3 million hits every month. So that's quite extensive. We have information specifically for employers, specifically for individuals. We have a whole cadre of materials that we call A to Z. It's a very wide variety of disabilities and health conditions, literally from the letters A to Z. We have a library of documents related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have materials specific to COVID-19. Those, although, we're not really seeing COVID totally in the rearview mirror yet, those pages do get an enormous number of hits every month still, and we're still putting new materials in. We have a feature that's called My Jan. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. We have just a vast array of publications on just about any topic you can imagine. Our people do trainings. We do between 90 and 100 trainings every year, and a lot of those are posted onto our training site. And then more about Jan if you really want to know more about us. We do have a good presence on social media as well, and that's just always a great way to keep up with things that are new. We're actually going to be launching a new service the 30th of this month. I can't say too terribly much about it at this point because they want to make a big media splash about it, but do check into our website come September 30th. It's like I say, a new feature I think a lot of people and especially employers are really going to like having. All right. Part of our website is what we call the Workplace Accommodation Toolkit. It's information about accommodation processes, the best practices, training videos, their sample forms and policies that you can use. So it is, toolkit's a very good description of it. There are tools there for you to use that are going to help you be able to provide the best working environment you can for employees with disabilities. MyJan, I said I'd be talking about that more in just a minute, and here it is. This is a feature, it's fairly new. I think it's been up about a year now. It allows users to have their own kind of, I call it a lockbox, a virtual lockbox, where you can store pages from our website that you're going to use frequently or that you would like to go back to again at some point, but you don't want to have to go through all the clicks necessary to reach that page. This lets you store those links in a password accessible location. You can go right back to them when you need them and use them anytime that you need to. You can share them with others if you want, share them with people in your HR department, or share them with HR professionals. Maybe you've got a job coach who's working with a person with a disability and you can make it available to them, however you see fit to use those materials. And that's been really popular. I've been really glad to see how well that's being used. I think probably rehabilitation professionals are the folks who have been using it the most. Okay, so that's probably enough about Jan and what we do. Oh, one of the things I did want to point out, as Dr. Knetzer pointed out earlier, AI is a rapidly expanding and advancing field. It's really difficult to keep up with. But I'm going to say our consultants are working really hard in order to constantly be right at the threshold of where AI stands in terms of the benefits of using it for people with disabilities and also any potential problems that it might cause for people with disabilities. I think this is going to be something that we're going to be working very hard at keeping up with. Certainly over the course of the next several years. It's going to be really interesting, I think, to see where it heads and potential benefits that can be reaped from it. But that's all looking down the road, and we'll just have to see where we end up with it after a while. All right, so I wanted to talk specifically about artificial intelligence and employment of people with disabilities. I'm going to take a look at some of the potential bias of AI in the hiring process, some accommodation examples involving AI for employees with disabilities, and also in trying to avoid some of the pitfalls of AI in making accommodations for people with disabilities in the workplace. So that said, let's kind of use our imaginations for a minute and think about, suppose that you've submitted your resume for a job. It's a job that you really, really want, your dream job. And like I say, you've submitted your resume, you've waited to hear back, and you get an interview. HR from the company contacts you and they want to set up a virtual interview. And the representative says, well, there are going to be 4 interviewers on this Zoom meeting. And you're just thrilled. That's just wonderful. Well, let's think about it just maybe with some specifics here. You're going to start thinking about what you should wear. What should you do with your hair? Do you want to get a new hairstyle, a new haircut? Where do you want to stage the meeting so that you have a really nice looking background and quiet so that maybe the kids don't go running through in the middle of this interview, or, mom suddenly pops in and asks you, what do you want for dinner? That kind of thing. And then HR comes back to you and notifies you, because there may be a requirement in their state, that the company is using an artificial intelligence software to analyze interviewees. Well, how does that change things from just you trying to meet and impress those 4 interviewers. So in essence, what you've got now is a situation where there are 5 interviewers, but 1 you can't even really interact with. And what criteria is that AI system going to even be using in order to evaluate you? Well, there was a group. Well, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Now, you've already told HR that you use a wheelchair. You're not sure what the other interviewers know or don't know, and you're not really sure if that's going to have any impact maybe on the AI's algorithm for assessing you, if in any way that chair is visible when you are doing your interview. And maybe that's something you can control, whether or not that's visible. But what about the fact that your eyes don't always appear focused on a single point? One of the factors we do know AI uses is eyes, where they're tracking, where they're watching, the focus that's involved. If that's a physical limitation that you have, how's that going to impact how the AI is assessing you for this position that you're qualified for? You know, you can do the job, but you're going to have to now kind of convince this artificial interviewer whether you can or not. There was an analysis that was done by Bavarian Broadcasting, and I've gone through this. The source for this is a sister project to Jan. It's, let me move my bar here a second, sorry. The Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT, which, you know, whether you think of it as like the bog or like the moss, PEAT. It's also a project of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. So on their website, which I'll show you later on, they have this set of interviews that were done being analyzed by an AI system. And some of the findings that they came up with from this were really pretty astonishing. So they had a young lady who went through just a typical interview kind of process, and the system evaluated her. And then they had her put on glasses. Everything else was identical, went through exactly the same interview process. And based simply on that one change, the AI system evaluated her as being a little bit less open, considerably less conscientious, not sure why glasses would cause that, a little less extroverted, a little less agreeable, and a tiny bit more neurotic. So just the glasses had that kind of an impact, which, you know, can be kind of significant if, you know, an employer, maybe somebody who wasn't participating in the interview, was looking at the results off of this, you know, and comparing you against somebody else that wasn't wearing glasses and got the higher scores. So then they checked to see what would happen if we had just a plain background versus a background with a photograph in it or a picture of some sort. And what they found there was that the background with the picture in the background, the person was evaluated by AI as being considerably more open, more conscientious, more extroverted, a bit more agreeable, and a lot less neurotic. So put a photograph of something or a piece of artwork behind you when you're going for an AI assisted interview, I guess is the lesson with that one. We then had one where they just somewhat darkened the background. And in this, the darker background resulted in a little less openness, good bit less conscientiousness, a little less extroverted, a little less agreeable, and more neurotic. Same as almost as wearing glasses, as if you have a darker background. And then Sorry, my cursor just jumped right off the screen. There we go. So how would you maybe be evaluated by AI during an interview? It's certainly something anymore to really keep in mind if you're going to be interviewing for positions, or if you have people interviewing for you in your business, and your business is now using artificial intelligence during the recruiting and interviewing process. Hopefully this kind of information gives people some second thoughts as to how seriously maybe they want to take the AI results. Maybe think a little bit about what characteristics the person was displaying, either as a part of themselves or in the environment in which they were doing the interview, that maybe has impacted on the way that they were evaluated.
DJ, can I jump in for a second here?
Sure.
Because I love these slides and the really striking differences that you pointed to there between these seemingly these
Minor.
meaningless.
Yeah.
Most of
Yeah.
us would say meaningless, apparently meaningless differences to where, if I did my interview with a painting in the background versus it's just a plain wall, or if I'm wearing my glasses versus my contacts, or any of these other differences that we might see. And so the point you raise about, how would you be interviewed? And, if you're going to use an AI system to interview, or if you're going to go into an interview situation where there's going to be an AI system, would you think twice or more carefully, et cetera? I think the next question for a lot of folks would be like, well, why does it even make those decisions? That they're kind of bizarre decisions. It's clearly it's a bias, but it's like not even a bias that maps directly onto what what we would consider to be a very like human-like bias, right? The historical biases that humans have against each other. It's not even mapping onto those. It seems to be this kind of arbitrary, bizarre distinction of glasses versus no glasses, of what is more neurotic. And so the question would be like, why does it learn those things? Like why? And this is one of those big ethical issues around using AI at the moment, whether it's a language based, or in this case, this is a visual image based AI, where all of it is a black box. And this is something that a lot of people talk about as one of the major challenges of using AI to enhance human decision making, because as a black box, it gets input on the one end, whether that input is words or a video, like a video stream of you doing an interview. The data goes in on one side, and something mysterious happens in that black box. There's
Yes.
just a ton of there's a ton of math, and there's a computational linguist, Emily Bender, who has referred to AI as just mathy math, like mathy math, mathy math, because there's a ton of math that goes on in that black box, math that is far beyond the human brain's capacity to think about it, to do it, to articulate it. And at the other end of that black box, out comes the output, to where it says this person's more neurotic, or this person is less desirable for a position. And that's really difficult, where there's no explainability for us to say, well, we know it determined them to be more neurotic because of this. I mean, we can test those differences in these experimental studies where, adding glasses or taking glasses away, and we see how that points out the problem of the black box and shifting those scores. And then we're like, well, why does that happen? And it goes back to, what I was saying around language-based AI just eating up all the internet, all the language and words and anything. If it could go to every library in the world and just consume every book, consume every website to get more words, to try to understand which words are related to other words. It's the same with the image and the visual, to where all of these visual and video-based AIs are consuming data in order to try to understand patterns. And what's interesting is that they're mapping those patterns, those empirical patterns, those patterns of how certain images are similar to others or not as similar to others. And they're mapping those patterns onto abstract values, like whether they're more trustworthy or
Hmm.
more neurotic.
Right.
That kind of mapping happens from this, if you were to take every picture and, and this is the concern about Facebook being, one of the subsidiaries of Meta, to where, are they going to just be using everybody's pictures on Facebook to train their visual AI data, to where, if that's the data that's being used to train AI and you're just kind of letting it learn stuff, this is what we call kind of unsupervised training, where we let the AI learn about these things on its own because it's too much data for any human brain to deal with. And you get these kind of seemingly arbitrary distinctions, but then you get also these very kind of human biased decisions that are being reflected in the data too, where, and I can point to those a little bit later, but I just wanted to pause and articulate that as how it's a really interesting phenomenon that consuming all these images that you would train, or all this video to train an AI to recognize a human face, to recognize qualities of a person as to how
Right.
they're presenting themselves. There's that leap from that mathematical relationship of patterns in a huge, massive amount of training data, and then turning that into this very human interpretation of saying that this kind of data pattern indicates more or less neuroticism in a person. And these kind of studies show that because it's just such an unwieldy, volatile, still emerging technology, it can make some of these bizarre decisions that pose real challenges when you think about, avoiding these biases and harms when using them to aid in decision making. I just wanted to pause on that for a second, but
Yeah. You'd think that these things would be much more human in terms of biases, or human based, that you would not expect a machine, if you will, to make those kinds of differentiations, as you said, on what seems to be pretty meaningless differences. Um, but apparently the machines do just as well as we do on creating biases, things that it's going to be taking into consideration when it's doing these evaluations. So yeah, I'd love to see some further work on how that gets decided, what kind of information it's using, and what is presented to it. I'd love to see it done on audio input. What differentiation does it make on a person's accent? So yeah, I think that would be kind of a lot of fun to do. Okay. Recently, the Society of Human Resource Managers did a survey, and they were asking, where are employers using AI right now? Well, I think not surprisingly, the vast majority of those that are using AI said recruitment and hiring, 79%. 41% are using it in learning, so their employee training areas, and in development. 38% are using it for performance management. A much lower percent, 18%, are using it for productivity monitoring. I tend to believe that's going to be an area where we're going to see very rapid increases. 8% in succession planning. I have to admit, that one was not one I had in my head. When I saw that, I was like, that's interesting. And then 4% using it for promotion decisions. So I thought that was very fascinating. As I said, not surprising that most folks are using it in the recruitment and hiring phase, but it is becoming more and more endemic in other areas of employment. And then one of the things I wanted to talk about was what we can do and what employers can do in order to create an inclusive hiring practice. First of all, make sure that all of your applicants receive information on how to request an accommodation during the hiring process. And be certain that you've included contact information. Whom should they contact to make that request? Maybe a little information as to what they're going to need to provide in order to get the accommodation that they're going to need so that the person can participate in the hiring process to their fullest capability. Next, respond promptly to accommodation requests. Don't just let those sit until the last minute. Be prepared. Get back to the person as quickly as possible. Get arrangements made for the accommodations that are needed if you feel that they do not present an undue hardship for your company, and have those in place well in advance. Consider having an HR representative conduct a review of all application and interview materials after the fact to identify and then hopefully correct for any potential biases that may have cropped up, whether those were introduced by a human in the process or whether they were introduced by an AI system, to try and level the playing field, as it were. And so now I wanted to give you a couple examples of using AI as accommodations. A couple of the areas that we're seeing happen more frequently at Jan is the use of AI-based speech-to-text programs that can provide ongoing translation for an employee who is deaf during meetings and interactions with coworkers. And that can have the potential for either eliminating or at least reducing the need for ASL live translators. No offense to our live translators today. Or the use of communication access real-time translation or CART services. Another possible use of AI as accommodation is kind of the flip side to that. A print-to-speech AI program would be able to provide someone who is blind or visually impaired with the ability to read all work-related materials without having to rely on a human reader or perhaps have it all translated into large print or Braille. It would be capable of allowing the person to listen to all of the materials that they would need for their training, for their onboarding, for getting their benefits set up, their interactions with coworkers, just daily communications. And one of the problems that we tend to see at Jan pretty frequently is that the use of personal assistants is viewed by many employers as being an undue hardship, something that is expensive for them to be able to provide. And whether or not that type of an accommodation really does reach that level is going to depend on a number of factors, how big the company is, how many employees they have, what their financial situation is like. But that can all impact whether or not they're actually able to provide a personal assistant. And certainly the use of AI in a situation such as that has great potential to reduce the costs that would be associated with providing the accommodation otherwise. Some of the complications that can arise that the Americans with Disabilities Act is going to get involved, if you will, in is be aware of emerging AI technologies and their uses. You need to monitor for any potential conflicts between available AI technologies and your company policies. As AI changes, as we've said again and again, it's changing very quickly and coming into play in a lot of different areas. And that could have the possibility of impacting with the policies that you've already established. You may need to make changes in them. You may need to decrease the rates at which certain materials are provided or whatever. But you keep an eye on what policies you have in effect. There are times when a company's policies just don't make sense for a person that has a disability. It may be discriminating against them in some way, that really a pretty minor change in the policies could make a significant difference. Be flexible in the use of AI to allow people with disabilities to become or remain effective employees. And also remember the blanket exclusions of the use of AI as an accommodation without considering situational factors is very likely, I'm going to say, lead to ADA violations. If you say to an employee, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you use that AI application because we just don't think it's appropriate for anybody to do, that's probably going to run you into difficulties with the ADA. You need to consider accommodations on a case-by-case basis. It may be that it's not necessarily appropriate for everybody in the company to use it, but it can mean the difference for a person with a disability in being able to perform all of the functions of their job. If you fail to provide a reasonable accommodation for a job applicant or for an employee that impacts them from being rated fairly and accurately, that's going to be a problem for your company. The employee could file a grievance or file a suit against you. You want to make certain that you are providing appropriate and adequate, reasonable accommodations. Again, if it raises to the level of undue hardship, you don't have to provide an accommodation. But really, I mean, in our experience over all these many years, it's very unlikely that there's no accommodation that can be used to, at some level or the other, allow the person to be able to perform job functions when they're otherwise qualified to do so. So I always suggest people, you're engaged in the interactive accommodation process, call Jan. If you have a question, you're not sure how to go about making an accommodation, you don't have to know everything about making accommodations. The whole area, the whole field is changing rapidly. There are other technologies that are becoming available that can allow a person with a disability to be engaged in numerous ways in the workplace that they couldn't before. So we know about those. We're keeping up with that. Call us, talk to our consultants, and we'll help you figure something out. If you're using an AI tool that screens out an individual with a disability, and whether that's being done intentionally or unintentionally, when the person would be able to do the job if a reasonable accommodation were used, that's going to get you into trouble. And then using an AI tool that violates the ADA's restrictions on disability-related inquiries and medical examinations. There are restrictions on how much you can ask a person with a disability before you make that job offer, or even after they're hired, if they don't disclose that there is a disability. You need to be careful as to how much you're asking, how much information you're trying to gather. And if you have an AI tool that in some way is helping you to get around that, that could be a difficulty for you as well. There are a number of resources. I've used them in this presentation. Certainly JAN is one. The Office of Disability Employment Policy. By the way, by the end of this month, they're supposed to be releasing a brand new artificial intelligence toolkit, which ought to be very helpful. We don't have a specific date on when they're going to be releasing that, but you can always check on their homepage. It'll show up there. The Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT, and then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is another one. Here are the ways you can get hold of us at JAN. Our website is askjan.org. We have that toll-free number, 800-526-7234. We have live chat at askjan.org, and we have an email address, jan@askjan. So please feel free to reach out to us, talk to our consultants, work with them. They'll be able to help you in lots of different ways. We have our social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. I had to think about that last one there for a second. YouTube. We have a lot of good stuff out on YouTube, by the way. And here are just the main websites. I've given the web addresses for the ODEP, PEAT, and EEOC. There's a specific document that I was using for this. It's AI guidance. And it's a really long link, but it's embedded in the presentation, and I'm sure Walt and his folks can get you copies of those slides and that link if you would like to see it. And I think that's it. If anybody has any questions.
But DJ, can I go ahead and I wanted to say just a couple more things
Sure.
Based on what you were saying around again, just a follow-up about the data you were showing and how there's something really kind of interesting and weird going on when AI systems make judgments about data and people. I wanted to share a couple more examples that just might be illustrative of all of that. One of these examples is, let's see if I can find it. One of these examples actually goes back before, because it's in everyone's best interest. Everyone who's developing AI tools, it's not as if they want to put biased tools out on the market. It seems to be something that's woven into the DNA of how these AI systems are making decisions. And so that's something to pause on. Prior to generative AI, back in 2018, there was kind of a big story around Amazon using an AI recruiting tool and how they had to kind of abandon this tool when there was a pretty public embarrassment around their use of it to augment and make their hiring workflow more efficient, where they had this tool that was looking at, all the applications that they are receiving. And I'm using this as an example because it gets at how an AI tool can develop a bias, because we say, like, how is it that this happens? But it can be this implicit bias of the training data that we base AI on. And that's a lot of the conversation right now around the ethical use of AI, is to talk about what kind of data it was trained on and how AI companies in the future can be more conscientious when seeking out data to train their models on. And in this case that we're talking about today, to make sure that there's data that's more inclusive and representative of all kinds of people, including people with all kinds of disabilities, for example, that would be just built into the training data as a more representative chunk of that data. What was happening with Amazon's hiring effort is that it turned out that, they were really not viewing women's applications very favorably for these positions. This AI tool was not viewing the applications of women very favorably, disproportionately so compared to men. And what they were looking at when they kind of had to do a post-mortem of this is they looked at how this AI tool was trained. They had to look at, how did you tell this AI tool what's a good resume or what's a bad resume, or what's a good qualification or a good candidate, or what is the type of profile of a desirable job seeker in this category. And because they were using the past, and I forget how many years, but the past number of years of data from people who had applied to positions at Amazon, been hired for positions at Amazon in these particular categories, when they looked at the data, they found that it was mostly men represented in that data. And it's not as if the AI was saying that the AI believed that women were less qualified than men, but it was learning all of these subtle things from the patterns in the data that might be more prevalent among male candidates and irrelevant to the job at hand. But when you looked at an application and a candidacy from a woman, then there might be some outliers or things that seem to be outliers in the data that would then place that lower in the rank for the AI's judgment. And there's a lot of other examples of how this can happen to where, for example, I'm switching over to a study in Nature to where AI can generate covertly racist decisions about people based on dialect. And so this is a study that, in essence, was asking generative AI platforms to make judgments about people and for the people and the characters they were asking it to make judgments about, they were using different kinds of dialects in English that are associated with different kinds of, let's say, racial identities or racialized identities. And they were finding that while it wasn't making any overt distinctions, it wasn't sort of being racist in the sense that we would have sort of imagined a large caricature of it, that it was still making these kinds of judgments about, you know, what people are like or who is more valuable in what area based on dialects that are connected to these racialized identities. One of the other studies that I wanted, or not study, but kind of examples I wanted to make sure to show in the visual, that came out in Bloomberg last year, and it was using Stable Diffusion, which is one of the visual AI tools that is out there. And for this kind of really extensive long form article that they wrote in Bloomberg, they gave Stable Diffusion thousands of different prompts. And all of those prompts were just telling it to give you the face of a person who holds a particular kind of job. They did not specify anything else about the person other than the job that they had, whether that job is a pilot or the job is, you know, let's say they work, they're an ice road trucker, or they work in a coffee shop, or they're on a farm, or whoever they are. They just gave them different kinds of jobs, and they used a scale of kind of assessing the pigmentation color on the output of the person that Stable Diffusion generated, as well as the gender presentation of the face on there. And so what they learned through all of this was that there was a pattern between jobs that tend to pay more money and jobs that tend to pay lower money. So they found that high-paying jobs were dominated by subjects with lighter skin, subjects with darker skin tones were more commonly generated by prompts for lower-paying jobs. And they found the same thing for gender presentation, where you have kind of more male presenting figures that were generated for kind of jobs that stereotypically in the data that it might have studied, because it's looking at just pictures on the internet, pictures and other data sources. And, as they say, garbage in, garbage out, if that data is already poisoned with a kind of implicit human bias, it's going to learn that. And so they found this, and I would recommend this article to anyone because it's just a really great way of visualizing how an AI, which is understanding the world through such a large macro scale compared to how we understand it, how AI can see patterns and how it can learn these kinds of biases based on the average, because it wants what is average and most likely. When you ask ChatGPT a question, it wants to give you the most likely or average kind of response, the most probable kind of response. If you ask Stable Diffusion to make you an image of a home in suburban Texas, then it wants to give you the most likely or average thing. That's what these things seek. And in doing so, they might replicate these kinds of biases that they learn. And even when you correct for these things, it can be really weird. It's a challenge that AI is still working on. Earlier this year, Google, which is not ChatGPT, but Google's Gemini, their own AI tool, was kind of doing the same thing that Stable Diffusion was doing in terms of having some pretty biased output to where anytime you asked it to make an image of something, it was typically male presenting, typically lighter skin tones that was coming out. And so Google tried to kind of correct for this. And in the end, it was just a really weird overcorrection on their part to where all of a sudden, for example, I'll kind of blow up the screen here. Um, when people were asking it to come up with images from like World War II, from Germany, that Gemini was trying to impose this kind of diversity and lack of bias on these kind of historical categories that in fact were a little bit more homogenous. And so it kind of went all the way over into the other direction, and Gemini or Google had to kind of shut down their Gemini image producer for a little bit as they course corrected. So there's lots of examples of this. Another good one is if you have Netflix or any others, is the documentary Coded Bias, which is it's about how facial recognition technology um, is implicitly biased against the kinds of faces that it's trained on. So if it's trained on lots of faces that tend to have a certain kind of skin tone, that tend to have a certain mathematical relationship to their features, then it's just going to be better at recognizing those kinds of faces than it is at other kinds. And so this is a great documentary that kind of pursues both the researcher that was following this project, as well as all the ways in which this logic is kind of living in different aspects of our culture in terms of using these technologies that seem to be objective at first because they're mathy, because they're numbers based, because they're computers. And there's organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League that are kind of working to spread awareness around these sorts of issues. But again, this is just a few things. There's even this idea for the language AI, so not visual, that's and this is more in my world of education, but um, programs that are designed to detect AI-based writing might be biased against non-native English writers based on some experimental work. Again, because AI is trying to seek the average or the most likely, and because people who are learning to speak and write in a new language tend to articulate themselves in more average ways. Like if I don't know French at all, for example. If I were trying to learn French, I'm not going to be fluent. I'm not going to be creative in my use of language. I'm going to try to just use the language in the most average and correct way as I possibly can if I'm learning French and trying to write in French. And so this was really important for us in the educational world because, if we're going to use AI detectors to try to sniff out when students are using AI to write their essays for them, then this might disproportionately bias us against non-native English writers and falsely accuse them of using AI. So this idea of bias can pop up in just so many different ways. And it's all as a result of kind of the weird way in which these AI technologies learn about the world, in which they seek to reproduce the most likely or probable, and how they're thinking in terms of these giant, massive, big data sets rather than how we as humans sort of navigate through our individual perception.
Well, Trey, I think that's something that really represents the difficulty of making AI accepting, if you will, of people with disabilities, because, as you've said, and we were talking about the other day, AI depends so much on big data, but people with disabilities don't there isn't a big data set available, if you will, about people with disabilities. And the population of people with disabilities is so diverse that you can't homogenize it. You can't find or come to the middle with that population. There's just nothing really, I think, for AI to kind of grab hold of and work with that way. And so I think it's always going to be an issue of AI being able to work well with people with disabilities, to evaluate them according to their true value and worth, because there just is never going to be enough information available to those systems to allow them to do that.
And that comes back to just a human problem. And it's a human problem, I would say, that's the very same for both the educational space and the employment space, in the sense that, we're using these AI tools to solve problems of scale and efficiency and all that. But we're kind of stepping over the part where we're already implicitly either making decisions ourselves or allowing the AI to make the decisions for us, um, in terms of what really matters for the job, what defines a desirable employee, what kinds of criteria or social contracts that we might have that are learned or inherited that aren't as relevant to finding the best employee for the job, right? In the same way that for the educational space, there's a lot of ways that we kind of carry forward kind of the traditional culture of the classroom or the traditional, social contract of the classroom. And it's our job to kind of interrogate critically and reflectively, what student learning really is and how we can, cast aside some of the more rigid expectations that might be exclusionary, that might put barriers up, for different kinds of learners that are largely irrelevant to assessing whether or not they've met the goals that we've set for them in the class. In the same way that for the hiring process, that same reflective work is that human element, so the AI problem is still a human problem
Right.
in that sense of deciding what's important and how we want to approach the process of bringing people on board and finding talent anywhere that it can be.
Thank you, Dr. Canaster and Dr. Hendricks, for this very helpful information. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rachel Womack and Bree Alslip for a few questions for our speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer, and thank you, Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Knatzer. This has been absolutely fantastic. We do have several questions prepared, but your presentation has been so thorough that I think we've actually worked our way through the answers to a few of those questions already. So that's wonderful. We'll do our best to narrow it down just a little bit. I do want to introduce myself very briefly. My name is Rachel Womack. I'm the training director and LEND director. That's Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities here at the Human Development Institute. I am joined by Bree Alsip, who is our brand new research assistant at the Human Development Institute and has been working with Dr. Bauer and I on a variety of projects. So Bree and I have just a few questions to ask. I know Dr. Bauer has one too, and we will try to wrap up our questions by maybe 2:50 so that we leave a few minutes for the audience to ask any questions as well. The first question that I have for our two panelists is perhaps a little bit broad, but we've talked a lot today about what AI is, how AI is impacting the employment landscape for people generally, and certainly how it's being used in the hiring process. I'm interested in knowing if there are other ways that you think AI will impact the future of employment for people with disabilities specifically. So maybe thinking about the creation of new jobs or perhaps the elimination of positions. So I'll turn that over to our panelists.
Okay, well, I'll take a stab at that, I guess, first. I've been around quite a long time. I was working in this field back in the 1980s when we first started seeing personal computers uh, really start what I call an employment revolution for people with disabilities, making new jobs available for a person with a disability that just had not even been a possibility before. And I think we're starting to see exactly the same kind of pattern taking place with AI. We're looking across a broad spectrum of disabling conditions, um, how it's going to cause changes in the way in which jobs are done, the types of positions that are available. As you said, maybe some new jobs will be forthcoming, maybe others will go away. Um, to me, I think the important part of this is just to kind of watch out, not hit the potholes as we move forward, making certain that people with disabilities are really able to avail themselves of the full potential of AI. Certainly when uh, those personal computers started coming along, a lot of times it was having to kind of go back and make adaptations and changes necessary for people with disabilities to be able to use them the way that other people were. And I think it's far better if we think about these things in advance and don't have to keep constantly taking a step back every time we take two steps forwards with something, but to already have in mind, how is this going to be used by people with disabilities? What changes maybe do we need to incorporate within the system itself so that people with a very broad range of disabilities are going to be able to use it? And certainly that's something where the concept of universal design comes into play. So that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to, is seeing how we can make these advances to increase opportunities for people with disabilities and yet not put in place some of these barriers that could result in discrimination. So um, I'll open it up. Trey, you got any comments you'd like to make on that one?
This is a really good coverage. I'll just add that, and I should probably balance my own presentation. I've hit pretty hard this idea of how AI can create an imbalance towards exclusion and bias. There's also the idea that, especially as AI becomes more ubiquitous, as it, hopefully becomes a bit more balanced in the way that it works. Um, as it becomes more integrated into different software and even hardware. And if we think about things like wearables and how it might possibly be kind of integrated into everyday objects, of course, I want to put out there, of course, the data privacy concerns and all that. That's very real. But I'm thinking about how there's another view of AI as a kind of, universal assistive technology that can be really pliable and plastic depending on kind of the needs of the user, and to kind of enhance their ability to interact with the world, understand the world, to work with ideas, to kind of understand things in different ways if they need to tailor some situations to their own particular needs. That's a possibility that's there. And it would be interesting to see how that would be a kind of one of the big thinkers calls it a co-intelligence, that can work with us all to kind of allow us to better customize our own kind of environments to where we can be the most successful.
All right, thank you both for answering that question. I believe we can move on to the next question that we have prepared. It's sort of similar. So the knowledge and information to know how to leverage AI for social networking is an advantage in our changing world of employment. LinkedIn specifically has become an important part of the job search for people seeking employment. So one example is that AI could be used to write a LinkedIn profile section in 400 words to highlight past employment experience. What are some other ways AI software can help the search for employment of people with disabilities?
Yes, this is great. I mean, this is a way that AI can be one of those personal augments. And I'll focus just for now on the language-based, the text-based AIs like ChatGPT or Claude. But uh, taking past experience, for example, and putting it into a different resume format, or looking at the unique genre of a LinkedIn post, or looking at the cover letter requirements for a particular job. I mean, it can be just a lot of unknowns and a lot of um, kind of unnecessary confusion around how to best package our experience and how to best kind of present it in ways that are persuasive for that particular job opportunity and that represent all of our strengths accurately, so that they can be persuasive. I find that AI tools can be incredibly helpful in suggesting ways that we can tailor our narrative, our information to those opportunities, even if it's like, a 400 character or less LinkedIn thing, or if it's going from one industry to a completely different industry that might have just some different expectations, different cultures, where different aspects of our experience might resonate more. And it can also help us brainstorm ways to kind of speak positively around some of the things that might be interpreted as challenging. For example, if we have, a break in employment or a gap in employment on our resume, how can we address that in ways that are persuasive, that showcase that, we're a strong candidate for the position. It's not about that part of our resume. Other things that it can help us do in the search for employment is kind of generating search strategies, for example. So using AI as this thinking partner to kind of run by different ideas of where should we be looking for kinds of jobs, or if we're interested in different kinds of work, what strategies can we use to identify what's out there? While AI is kind of iffy in terms of information retrieval, it's also really good for, like kind of identifying different areas that you might try to look for jobs, or different search terms. If you're using a database to find some jobs, what are some alternative search terms you might use if you're not really coming up with anything that matches what you're interested in? So it can just be ways of doing all that to kind of just offload a lot of the cognitive efforts and add all of the superpowered energy that it has to brainstorm ideas, to translate different ideas into different genres or different fields, and enhance that ability so that you could maybe spread yourself out a bit more and a bit more quickly in looking for jobs.
Oh, that made me think of something. There is a system that exists now. It's called ONET. It's been around for quite a while. And it contains information. It's kept up to date, but information on just any type of job that you can possibly imagine, what the skills are that's required for it, any education that's needed for it, any licenses that may be needed for it, or certifications, all of the different tasks that are typically associated with that particular job. And it also has the ability for, whether it's a state or a region or even a local area, to tell you what the needs are for people with that position in that geographic area. And it's used, I think, mostly by rehabilitation professionals. They're working with their clients, trying to figure out what's going to be the best job route for that person to take, and what education or training might be needed in order to allow them to avail themselves of those available jobs. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we had an AI system that could interview the client and use ONET, all those details that are in ONET about the requirements for job positions and what's available in the person's local area, and just work to figure out what the individual's interests are, what their skill set might be, and just bring all of that together, and maybe kind of reduce what is a very large time commitment on the part of rehabilitation counselors. Just a thought.
And you can kind of do that. I mean, that's a process, what you're talking about, of integrating a sort of an AI practice interviewer with all of that existing data that's in different areas. I mean, that's a process, but that is a use case for AI to help people, is as practice for interviewing in situations, as practice talking about things in a particular way. It can give feedback, even though I want to, put an asterisk on that, because as I did show, it's generating words based on probability. So it doesn't really know anything, but it can still give you feedback that can be formative and helpful if you're using it as a interview partner, as a conversation partner, especially because that can be low risk. You're just talking to an AI. It's kind of an easy thing to do. There's nothing at stake there. So people have used it for that, practiced at conversation, practiced at interviewing too.
All right, thank you both for that. In the interest of time, if it's okay with you, Dr. Bauer, I'm thinking let's open the floor to questions from the audience. And if we have time, I know Dr. Bauer actually has a question involving an interesting real world scenario. So depending on how many questions we have from our audience, perhaps we can fit that one in as well. But I do want to make sure that our participants have the opportunity to engage with our presenters.
Questions from our participants. As Dr. Womack has said, you could put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you could also unmute and ask your question.
And I did see you both received several thank you messages in the chat.
Good afternoon. This is Joshua Stiegel talking. I'm the co-chair with HDI, the Consumer Advisory Council. I've very much enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. One question I have for the both of our presenters is, and this is kind of a weird one, but so like we said, AI, from what I can understand, what needs to be addressed to the employers and employees, I think, is AI is human control, or is human controlled, as someone said by Meta had to shut down their AI for a few days because of something was going wrong, or ChatGPT had to shut down their AI for a few days for the same situation. So is there a way that employers could say to their people when reviewing, say for the AI interview process, if they're using AI as part of the interviewing process, hey, as a consultant, use your own, you look at the AI, but also use your own judgment and don't rely solely on the AI. Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense, Joshua, and I think that's exactly the kind of organizational culture that we would want to advocate for as we look ahead to where there will be the integration of AI in different aspects of organizations in the future. And one of the important kind of culture parts of that is getting everybody on board with this idea that AI might feel more objective at first, but that it really does require that layer of judgment and accountability from the human perspective. And it's also important to even be a bit more reflective than that. So you're talking about like an interview situation where, um, let's say that there's this layer of interviews and you have kind of all of the AI feedback and judgments and data about those interviews. And maybe some of the interviews are being flagged a lot more than others and flagged for human review, let's say. And,
Right.
you
Right.
know, and so that's important, of course, to have that layer of human review. This is similar to a conversation we've had in education, particularly since COVID, when a lot of students had to suddenly take exams online through video proctoring. And so we're using a lot of video proctoring. And so it's very similar situation as the interviews in the sense that you have video input of somebody doing something and a computer or kind of automated system scrubbing all of that for moments to flag for either instructor review or hiring official review or whoever review. Just that additional layer of accountability I wanted to refer to is just even a self-awareness that only certain things being flagged can itself sort of predispose us to be a bit more critical towards certain either applicants or students if others are not being flagged at all. And so we just want to be careful not to view certain applications or certain students' exams sessions with more scrutiny than others simply because a computer has decided to flag them, but that we rather engage with an open mind in that human layer of accountability, right? That we don't approach it with like an attitude of suspicion.
Right. 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 I'm not even talking about flagging. I'm even talking more about, let's say the meeting is being recorded and the data the AI is collecting and what the AI is thinking is being recorded and given back to the human. And
Yeah.
then the human looks at it from the point of view of, okay, this is what I think, this is what the AI thinks. What do I want to take from the AI and what do I want to use as the employer, as the human with 2 ears, 2 legs, and 2 eyes?
Yeah.
You know, I have a I'm gonna say this, and I'm sorry if it sounds kind of smart mouthy, but the humans came first.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
invented the AI, so we need to make sure that we, the employers, and the potential new employees and uh, employees that are already hired know, hey, AI is controlled by humans. It hasn't reached, iRobot, Will Smith capacity yet.
Yes, exactly right. Agreed. I want to say that Gregory Stanton's asking in the chat a really good question, but can AI be used to draft resumes that could make it past certain biases? I think what's a really good opportunity here is that you can use AI platforms as a creative partner when you are drafting, let's say, a resume or a cover letter or whatever other documents you're going to need for a job application. You can tell it what you want. The limit is really based on your own imagination of, you can tell an AI tool that, you're looking for feedback based on certain criteria, that you're looking for parts of, whatever the document is, for areas that might be prone to, bias when an AI interprets it. And then you can even ask the AI tool to suggest ways that you could, enhance that document in that area in a way that's accurate, to your candidacy, to your experience, to your history, that's still accurate to all that, but in a way that might be less likely to fall victim to either human or AI bias, because you could tell it that you're looking for both, right? That you're looking for aspects of your application that, you know, might be interpreted incorrectly or that might inadvertently affect your chances. And so it's a really good thought partner for those things. And, you know, it's about kind of interacting with the AI with a back and forth there. It's not going to be like a clinical degree of accuracy that you work with these things and they're going to give you like a report with everything, but they'll behave exactly like a capable human partner in the sense that as long as you talk to them back and forth and you kind of explain what you need and what they're supposed to do, you can get some good ideas based on the kind of question that you're asking.
Thank you for that question, Gregory. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time together. As advertised, this has been great. It's been an honor and a privilege for all of you to join us. I want to thank Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Knatzer for taking time out of their day to share their experiences and expertise with us. It has brought richness to this conversation. Be well, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you much, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you both so much.
Bye-bye.